I would like to begin by thanking you for being here for my presentation and for all of the student presentations. I know that you guys are all busy, but it does mean a lot to us students when you do come and support us in our research projects. My policy, excuse me, my presentation was an analysis of state prison suicide prevention policy, and I analyzed these policies for every single state from every year between 2005 and 2015. I also do have a poster presentation in the back if you would like to view it. There is some information on there that is not available in my keynote. I began this research project originally in Dr. Todd's methodology of political science class. It was originally my final end of the semester project, and it very much became a lot more than that. It also became the research that I conducted through the sugar program during 8 weeks last summer. I've worked on it much more after that 8-week period, and Dr. Todd and I would like to continue. He'd like to continue proofing my work into the following year. So, an introduction to my theory. Throughout an extensive literature review that I compiled, I found that 3 variables significantly impact the prison suicide rates each year in every single state, and those 3 variables were funding, prison crowding conditions, and the implementation of a suicide prevention policy or program by the state through legislative action. I focused primarily on the suicide prevention policies, although for a lot of instances I did control for variables such as funding and for prison crowding conditions. Those other 2 variables, funding and crowding conditions, I was able to measure through a prison's daily inmate cost. That was always around $20. In some instances, a little bit more, a little bit less sometimes. And for prison crowding conditions, I looked at a few different measurements of that variable, like rated capacity, operational capacity, and design capacity. Eventually, like I said, my research did orient itself around determining the number of suicides within each year in a state and the degree to which policy had or had not been implemented. I did find this relationship to generally correlate. The higher level of policy implementation that a state had, the lower the number of suicides that state would have in that year for that prison. I would like to preface this by saying that I did not look at private prisons, nor did I look at female prisons, because they are subject to a lot of different variables. Men's state prisons also generally had the most amount of data available, and there's much more literature available on those specific types of prisons. In conducting my literature review, I looked at both national standards from the Bureau of Prisons. Most of these standards were written by Lindsay Hayes, who has been working in the field since the 80s. His original report was an analysis of all state prisons in the 80s, and he later did one in 2008 in which he looked at those prisons several years later. I also looked at standards set by the American Psychiatric Association, as well as standards implemented by the World Health Organization in 2007. Generally, all of these standards were the same. And while there are many variables in suicide, in specifically focusing on prison suicide prevention policy, all of those standards, including the international standards, the APA standards, and Mr. Hayes' standards were the same. The US does not regulate or have a mandatory inmate prevention policy, despite these international standards having been available for a significant period of time. And there are several states that do not have any policy at all. Those states would eventually, in my research, receive a level 0 implementation rating because they did not have any policy for the prisons to look at. Here I just have a short graph showing in 2015, the levels of policy implementation for the 50 states and then the federal level as well. So you can see that a high level of prisons, 12 states, do not have any prison suicide policy written. Some states have had their policies written by Lindsay Hayes himself. States like California in 2016, which is excluded from the data that I looked at, just recently had their policy revised by Mr. Hayes. Connecticut in 2006, I believe, also had their policy written by Hayes himself, because Hayes was the original author of the national standards and a contributing author to the World Health Organization standards. Those policies, as one would expect, aligned perfectly with the index, which I would later create in my research. A major part of my research was this quality assessment guideline. In reading those international and national standards, was able to find several different categories of which policy would have to be implemented. These categories are training, identification, referral, and evaluation, communication, housing, observation and treatment plans, intervention, notification and reporting, and then my favorite to say, critical incident stress debriefing and mortality morbidity review. Some of these categories had different levels of implementation able to be achieved. Some categories were standalone. For example, identification, referral, and evaluation. You can see that it is a one-level category, level 1 category, whereas training had 3 specific things outlined within that category. Therefore, states were able to either partially implement that category or fully implement it if they matched all 3 of the levels set out in those national and international standards. As a result, as a total, a perfect score, a perfect implementation policy would receive a rating of 17 points, which is just the total of all of those categories added together. The first category is training. The key aspect of training was that there should be 8 hours of initial suicide prevention training when somebody is first hired at the prison, and then 2 hours of refresher training every single year. This was a 3-level category because a state could either not mention training at all and receive a 0, mention the initial 8-hour training and receive 1 point, mention only the 2 hours of refresher training and receive 2 points, or have the entire policy written out in this exact language and receive a full implementation rating. Identification, referral, and evaluation only had 1 point assigned to it, and this primarily focused itself around the intake screening for suicide risk. Although I didn't look at the actual variables associated with demographics who are considered a high risk for suicide, it was interesting to me to learn that the most at-risk demographic would be a white male between 20 and 30 who had received some level of higher education, so some completion of college. One can speculate as to the reasoning behind that. I chose not to. The next level that I looked at for my policy was communication. Communication was, again, a 3-level category and could have 3 levels of implementation. This included communication between the arresting or transporting officer and correctional staff, communication amongst facility staff, and communication between the staff and the suicidal inmate. Housing, as one could expect, suggested that it avoided isolation and should be as suicide resistant as possible, free of all obvious protrusions, and provide full visibility. When inmates, in my research, I learned that when inmates are isolated, they do have greater privacy, and therefore they are at a greater likelihood to commit suicide when they are alone, as if they are housed in a dorm or with a roommate, or cellmate, I'm sorry. The next level was the observation and treatment plan. This included 2 levels of observation, close observation and constant observation, which are described here. The next level was intervention. I found this category to be the category in which states were most lacking in their policies. Very few states received a full implementation rating for intervention. States could, again, I see Dr. Chapman holding up his fingers and counting. States could either not mention this at all and receive a 0 rating, mention the first section of it and receive 1 point, mention the first and second, receive 2 points, or mention all 3 and then receive a full implementation rating for this category. Notification and reporting. The key language here is in bold for you, that all appropriate officials should be notified through the appropriate chain of command for that prison, and that all staff who had contact with the victim before the incident should be required to submit a statement. Critical incident stress debriefing and mortality morbidity review. For every completed suicide, as well as every serious suicide attempt, should be examined through a mortality morbidity review process. This essentially is a lot of paperwork that prison officials are required to submit in the case of a serious incident or a completed suicide. Looking at successful policy implementation, several states did receive perfect implementation scores, whether that was because they simply aligned their language with those national and international standards, or because Lindsay Hayes himself wrote the policy for that state. Once I assigned, one phase of my research was assigning an implementation level for each state for each year. Once I was able to assign a policy level implementation rating for that state, I then compared it to the number of suicides occurring each year and was able to find a rate per 1,000. And as I had suspected, I did find a positive correlation between the data, that the higher a level of policy implementation that a state prison has, the lower the amount of suicides occurring that year would be. Some states, like Kentucky and Alaska and Massachusetts in 2005, before I had said Connecticut, I'm sorry, I meant Massachusetts. Before Lindsay Hayes wrote the policy for Massachusetts, Massachusetts had no policy at all. Therefore, it received a 0 implementation rating for 2005 and prior. And the exact opposite of the slide we looked at before, when states had no policy implementation or a very low-level policy implementation, they had a higher rate of suicides occurring each year. I would like to add that gathering the data on this was a large, very time-consuming part of this process. States are not required to release the number of suicides that occur each year. However, the Federal Bureau of Justice Statistics does take a 10-year review from prisons in which the prisons would respond with the number of suicides that occurred within that 10-year period. In cases like that, Alabama is a good example. Sorry, Dr. Tan. I would simply divide that number by the 10-year period and create an average for every single year. This was somewhat of an impediment in my research because when we were looking at a year-to-year change, having an average and seeing a policy implemented in one of those years where there was an average, we weren't necessarily able to find the correlation that I was looking for. A large part of my data did come from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, where states would report those 10-year averages, as well as some information on their prison capacities and so on. A lot of my information also came from reading the individual reports released by prisons each year. Most prisons reported and made available online some type of fiscal review annually, and from there, that's where I was able to determine those other variables like the cost of prisons per inmate per day was through those annual reviews. Occasionally, those reviews also did include information like the number of prisons occurring that year in that prison, and that was very helpful. Not always, however. I also would like to mention that there is some discrepancies in those numbers reported by prisons. For example, literature suggests that if an attempt was made at a prison and that inmate was later transferred to a hospital and died either en route to the hospital or at the hospital, they would not be considered as having committed suicide in prison. Although the incident itself did occur on prison grounds, because the death did not, they were not counted in that population. I am out of slides, but I do have an example of some of the policy that I looked at over on my poster presentation. For example, I excerpted a part of Vermont's prison policy, and I've highlighted the date that it was released. It was released between that 2005 and 2015 period. Because it was released later in the year, I was only able to ascribe the policy implementation rating that the new policy received for the year after its publication. In assigning that implementation rating, I compared the exact language and content of the policy to those national and international standards. So if we go back to something like observation, if the policy specifically wrote out close and constant observation, it would receive the full implementation rating. So I didn't make any of the, it wasn't necessarily subjective. I very often used things like find and replace on the computer, and able to look at that exact language and see how closely it aligned to those international and national standards. In many cases, if the state did not use the same language, I would also read through the policy and see how closely aligned the content was to the standards stipulated in those national and international standards. So that's exactly how I was able to rate prison policies that year and assign them that implementation rating. That is, in summation, my research project. I would like to continue my research and maybe find, looking at specific categories, which category appears to be the most significant in impacting that suicide rate each year. In addition, I also hope to find more specific data, like I had said, because a lot of the states only provide averages for the number of suicides occurring within a 10-year period. I would like to be able to actually ascribe a specific number so that I'd be able to view the correlation between states and their implementation ratings, which I was able to do for a majority of the states, but some states like Alaska and Alabama just did not make that information available. So, if you have any questions, Dr. Horcott. Well, I was, in my write-up of the project, I was very specific to stipulate that I was not actually suggesting any reform. I'd rather like the data to speak for itself, because there is a visible correlation between policy and the actual numbers of suicides occurring. I'd rather let that stand alone, because I'm not an expert in the prison field, and nor do I have any legislative background, so I wouldn't actually like to make any suggestions, but rather let the data stand on itself. I did reach a very good stopping point in this data. I would like to, again, review it and maybe add some additional years, and again, specify some specific fields where I was only able to come up with a general number. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, so I understand what you're saying because, again, learning about that at-risk demographic was something that I found to be a common theme in my literature review of state prisons. I did not read any papers that looked at the discrepancies between states. Um, and again, I feel as though that specific aspect, analyzing that demographic, does tend towards more of a psychological aspect of prisons rather than policy review. One of the papers that I read suggested that that specific demographic is more at risk because that demographic feels as if it's more likely to lose something in being incarcerated, where other populations may feel as though prison is something that they grew up around, and therefore it's not as, shocking or detrimental to them. That is interesting. Yes. Hmm. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, and it is incredibly, I see what you're saying now. It is difficult because so much of that specific data, like when you're looking at the number of suicides occurring in prisons that year, you're not able to view who that person was and whether they were part of that high risk population, that high risk demographic. All of that is, it's not open for like public viewing or for research purposes. However, I do think that that would explain some states having higher numbers of suicides occurring if that at-risk demographic makes up a majority of the population, I would suppose. Yeah. Yeah, that's you always have such great suggestions. And that is a route I would be interested in looking at, Dr. Chapman. Yes. It is fascinating because Mr. Hayes's reports have been around, like I said, since the 80s, but many states did not implement policy until, um, I would say, the mid to late 2000s. Massachusetts, for example, only adopted the specific policy in late 2005, and so I was only able to ascribe that rating to them in 2006 and after. Um, States differing so much in what they prioritize, it is just a matter of what the population of that state finds important and the legislative action that follows. Um, yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that because I am working with Dr. Miller right now to see if this research is something I'd be able to apply to the Fulbright program, which everyone here should check out if they're a student. And I would be interested in doing a comparative of this research with another country. We all look to Scandinavia for having the most productive, I would say, prisons, the most humane, with the highest level of people being released from prison, returning back to become productive members of society. One of the things lacking, I think, in United States prisons is the lack of vocational skills or education that inmates are able to receive while incarcerated. Thus, they're more likely to go back into prison upon release, whereas other countries very much focus on developing skills of inmates. So when they're released back into the country, they can become um, productive members. Uh, I would like to look at specifically Japan if I was to do a comparative approach, because Japanese culture is a culture that um, suicide is so solemn to them and it's a very large part of their heritage. I would like to see, and of course that idea of shame and family honor, I would like to see how prison affects Japanese populations because of the specific cultural outlooks that that society has. So that's something I would absolutely love to do. Are you raising your hand or stretching? Dr. Poe. So private prisons there are some, I'll answer your second question first. There are some loopholes in legislation that don't mandate that private prisons regulate themselves in the same way that state-run facilities do. That's why state-run prisons were such a good thing to look at within this project because they align directly with the state legislature. What was the first part of your question? Yes, so the federal level implemented this policy, was the original entity to mandate this policy. States regulating their state prisons are not required to follow any federal guidelines, which is why some states like Kentucky, for example, although these standards have been about for a significant period of time, have still not written a policy. In addition, I would assume that states would have a vested interest in implementing policy because it doesn't look good for a state prison either to have such a high number of suicides occurring within its facilities. That begs a whole slew of constitutional questions. They're not so. In one of the Midwestern or Southern states, I did review several news articles as well, where the conditions surrounding prisoners' suicides were a little bit murky, and the reporters very often noted that other states do have these prevention policies. Why doesn't our state? And so that kind of outside pressure does put some heat on the prisons to implement this kind of policy through legislation. But again, not all states have followed suit. Florida is somewhere in the middle towards the lower level of policy implementation. Good question, Dr. Todd. I would have to look. I can't recall. I think I had about 650 different rows of data on my entire master log. I haven't. Yeah, I know you didn't memorize it, Dr. Todd. You oversaw it. I'm just about out of time. I would love it if you would all look at my poster presentation. Like I said, I did include some information there that was not in my this version of my PowerPoint. But if you are curious to see how I did ascribe that rating to specific policies, I do have an example there for viewing. Thank you so much.